The notice appeared before dawn. It was nailed to the weathered post outside the dry goods store, placed there by a hand that wanted it seen early, before excuses, before explanations, before the truth had time to wake. The paper was clean. The ink careful. The language carried the weight of law. And at the center of it was his name. By the time the rancher rode in from the north pasture, 3 men stood reading it. None of them looked up when his horse's hooves slowed in the dirt. They finished the notice first, as though it deserved their full attention, then turned together. Their eyes did not accuse. They measured. The words accused enough. It said a man bearing his name had stopped a traveler on the east road. That he had taken her purse, threatened her with a pistol, and fired into the dirt to frighten her boy when the child cried. It said the woman fled west at nightfall, shaken and penniless. It said witnesses existed. The rancher read it twice. He did not tear it down. Inside the store, conversation thinned to silence. A sack of grain slipped from someone's hands and split open on the floor. No one bent to gather it. He could feel the shift, the old, dangerous moment when a community decides who a man is before he speaks. He bought nothing. He said nothing. When he stepped back into the sun, the notice was still there, moving slightly in the breeze, as if alive. By noon, the consequences arrived without ceremony. A rider passed his gate and did not wave. A water barrel was overturned by evening. At dusk, a fence line near the creek lay cut clean through, the wire bent low enough for cattle to wander. These were not accidents. They were messages. That night, the rancher sat at his table and cleaned his rifle, not because he intended to use it, but because routine steadied the hands. He thought of the East Road. Of a woman alone with a child. Of fear pressed into motion. He had never been there. Names, he understood, were easier to move than men. Before sleep took him, a final sound reached the house, the distant crack of a board somewhere in town, and the murmur of voices carrying just far enough to reach his land. By morning, the lie had settled in. The town believed it now. The rancher rode into town at first light, when the streets still belonged to sweepers and men who preferred not to be seen. The notice was gone, but its work remained. He could feel it in the way doors opened slower, in how faces turned just a moment too late. He did not go to the sheriff. He did not go to the church. He went where truth survived by keeping its voice low. At the livery, the hostler paused mid-brush when he saw him. Straw hung in the air between them. The man's eyes drifted to the rafters, then to the open door. "You ought not ask," the hostler said finally, his tone careful, almost respectful. "I didn't," the rancher replied. That was answer enough. At the far end of the street, he found the woman who poured coffee for men who had nowhere else to sit. Her hands shook from age or memory. She did not look up when he took the bench across from her. "Names travel easy now," she said, setting the cup down. "Lighter than saddlebags. Lighter than guilt." "Who carries them?" he asked. She stirred the pot though nothing remained inside. "Men who don't intend to keep them." Outside, the wind slid along the boardwalk. Somewhere, a door closed softly. There was talk then, not spoken, only past. Of a figure who followed such trails. Not a marshal, not a hired gun. Something older. Something that arrived after damage was done, when correction was the only thing left. No one said the name. No one ever did. They spoke of him the way people spoke of weather they could not outrun. Of boots that made no sound. Of men who woke to find their papers worthless and their courage thinner than dawn light. The rancher listened and did not interrupt. You won't see him, the woman said at last. Seeing means it's already over. As the rancher stepped back into the street, he noticed how quiet the town had become. Not fear. Calculation. The kind that waits to see which way the ground will shift. That evening, as the sun fell red behind the ridge, the rancher rode east. The road bore fresh tracks. A woman's. A child's. And over them all, heavier impressions that did not belong to either. He followed them into the gathering dark, knowing now that the lie carried his name, and that something else was already moving to correct it. The east road narrowed as it left the town's reach, the ground changing from packed dirt to a softer mix that remembered every passing thing. The rancher dismounted where the wagon ruts broke apart and knelt. The tracks told their story plainly. A woman walking fast. A boy stumbling to keep up. Fear pressed into the soil. He followed until the land dipped toward Dry Creek, where cottonwoods leaned as if listening. There, the trail bent hard south, not the direction of safety, but of pressure. Someone had turned them. Near the water stood a shack, thrown together from old boards and patience long spent. Its door hung open. Inside, the place smelled of ink and cold ash. No bed. No stove. Just a table and a crate. On the table lay a ledger. The rancher did not touch it at first. He read the room the way he read land, what was absent mattered more than what remained. No personal effects. No food. This was not a dwelling. It was a station. When he opened the ledger, the weight of it surprised him. Names filled the pages, written and rewritten, some scratched out, others corrected. Fines assessed. Deeds transferred. Notices issued. His name appeared more than once. Not as a signature. As a weapon. The traveler had been a test. A push. If she fled, the land would be claimed for delinquency. If she stayed, pressure would continue until she broke. Either way, the paper would read clean. He followed the entries outward, realizing the pattern was larger than a single road or town. This was not theft born of hunger. It was removal. Slow. Methodical. Law-shaped. By sundown, he understood the scope of it. Men were being erased by borrowed names, their resistance blamed on ghosts that could not answer for themselves. The rancher closed the ledger and carried it outside. The creek murmured beside him, indifferent and eternal. He did not burn it yet. As night fell, he felt it then, the sense of being weighed, not watched. A presence that did not rush, did not threaten. Only waited. From the dark beyond the cottonwoods came the faintest sound of boots touching earth. No announcement followed. Only a pause, as if the land itself had taken a breath. The rancher did not turn when the steps stopped behind him. He knew better than to greet what had not yet decided to speak. The creek kept moving. The night insects held their rhythm. Only when the air shifted did he look up and see the man standing where the cottonwoods thinned. There was nothing remarkable about him. That was the point. A coat worn thin. A hat without shape. Boots dulled by distance. The reckoner did not ask for the ledger. He waited. The rancher set it on the table inside the shack, open to the first page where his name had been pressed into service. The other man stepped forward, slow enough to count the seconds, and read without touching. "This isn't one road," the rancher said. The reckoner nodded once. That was the only agreement he offered. By morning, the town believed it was safe again. The clerk opened his office. The deputy polished his badge. The speculator arrived from the south with papers folded neatly in his coat. They had mistaken silence for absence. The reckoner moved through them without hurry. He listened. He asked for nothing that wasn't already owed. The system spoke freely when it thought itself protected, of necessity, of progress, of pressure applied for the greater good. The woman and the boy were never mentioned. At noon, the rancher stood in the clerk's doorway and placed the ledger on the counter. Ink hands trembled. Smiles thinned. The deputy rested his palm on his belt, unsure which part of it to trust. "You're mistaken," the clerk said. "These matters are lawful." The reckoner stepped into view then, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He said nothing. He did not need to. The men understood what had come for them. That night, the ledger burned behind the shack at Dry Creek. Page by page. Name by name. Ash fell into the water and vanished. When the last page curled into nothing, the reckoner spoke at last. "Tomorrow," he said. It was not a promise. It was a sentence. Morning came clear and cold, the kind that stripped things down to what they truly were. The men arrived at Dry Creek separately, as if distance between them might dilute responsibility. The deputy came first, badge bright against his coat, eyes searching for authority that would answer him. The clerk followed, papers clutched tight, lips moving in silent rehearsals. The speculator arrived last, confident enough to be late, smiling as though this were still a negotiation. The reckoner waited where the ground dipped toward water. The rancher stood back, not hidden, not involved. This was not his part. Words were offered. Explanations. The system speaking in its own defense. It spoke of jurisdiction and signatures. Of necessity. Of a frontier that demanded firmness. The reckoner let them finish. Then he stepped forward. What followed was swift and exact. The deputy reached for his pistol and found the motion answered before it completed. He fell without sound, the badge turning dull in the creek mud. The clerk dropped his papers as if they had burned him, they scattered and soaked, ink bleeding into nothing. The speculator ran, only until his breath failed him, then stopped, understanding arriving too late. No shots were wasted. No cruelty lingered. By the time the sun stood overhead, the water carried scraps of paper downstream, proof dissolving into memory. The reckoner cleaned his hands in the creek and stepped back. The balance had shifted. The land did not celebrate. It never did. Dry Creek ran the same as it always had, carrying away what no longer belonged. By afternoon, the birds returned to the cottonwoods. By evening, the road lay empty again, as if it had never learned the weight of boots or lies. The rancher remained until the reckoner was gone. There was no farewell. No accounting. The man stepped into the trees and the space he left behind closed as naturally as water. Later, some would argue he had never been there at all. The town changed without announcement. The clerk's office stayed shut. The deputy's badge was found days later, rusted and face down where cattle drank. New men arrived slowly, careful with their words, respectful of ink and consequence. The traveler passed through again before winter. She did not stop. The boy's shoe was mended. That was enough. At his ranch, the fences held. The cattle stayed. The name returned to its proper weight. Years on, when wind worried the boards outside the store, men would lower their voices and remember. They would say names were not owned, only carried, and that some debts followed the paper until the land itself demanded correction. The rancher listened when those stories were told. He never added to them. And the ground, once settled, remembered who had stood still when the lie tried to move.